Good evening. Thank you for coming. Who would agree with me that God had no idea what he was doing when he created men and women? You would agree that God had no idea what he was doing?
No.
Thank you. No one, because God knows everything. Yet for some reason, we still argue because we don't understand why she doesn't think the way I do, why he doesn't think the way I do. And this misunderstanding, miscommunication often leads to divorce. So divorce is ever increasing in our country, even within the church. Actually, statistics show now that Christian divorce rate is higher than the secular divorce rate. Highest divorce rate is anyone who gets married under the age of 21, and the fastest growing cases of those getting divorced are those who have been married over 20 years. So coupled with this, we have society that's always fighting against us, wanting to redefine marriage, wanting to redefine gender roles. So as most of you know, I've spent the last 2.5 years taking psychology and Christian counseling classes from Liberty University. When I was a boy, this is a career I wanted to pursue. I pursued the Army, wanted to learn how to be an expert in warfare. And many years later, God has directed me back to what he called me to do as a teenager, which is much gentler, but it still involves warfare, because there's a war going on in our country against marriage. So there are a lot of organizations, Christian organizations, ministries, which are fighting for marriages, like Focus on the Family with Dr. James Dobson and Jay Sekulow of the American Center for Law and Justice. So one of the biggest problems with communication in marriage and why they fall apart, as Dr. Dan Allender, who's a Christian psychologist and licensed therapist, and a guest speaker for Liberty University's course on family and marriage counseling, says marriage is supposed to be spiritually intimate, which should grow faith, hope, and love within a marriage. But this doesn't grow within a marriage because of the penalty of sin. So for women were created to be relational. This is partly seen in the fact that, as Dr. Allender relates, women speak on average, 40,000 words a day. Men speak an average of 1,000 to 2,000 words a day. So that's a huge difference. And we all know in order for relationships to be nurtured, there has to be communication. So we see that God purposely designed women to be relational and to communicate. But yet, women often get upset with men because we don't talk more and don't communicate more. And men get upset with women because, so many people say, well, she talks too much. And we don't realize that inadvertently we're blaming God, because that is the way he created each gender. That's the way we were designed. That's the way our brains are set up. And yet we still wonder why the other doesn't think like we do. We have to learn to communicate with each other and understand how each other thinks and reacts. The core male problem is that for men, there's futility in life and trying to gain accomplishment in work. So part of this is seen in why men try to rule their wives by shame and fear. It's also why men outnumber women 21 to 1 in sexual assaults and 15 to 1 in physical abuse. Because God designed men to be the leaders of their family, but not to dominate. We're to lead, just as Jesus leads the church out of love. It's something that's just given and it's just done. The key to successful marriage is to relate to God as God designed us. Dr. Egerich, whose book is required reading for Liberty University's Counseling for Women, wrote a book, Love and Respect. And he talks about that God purposely designed men to feel respected. And he purposely designed women with a need to feel loved, which is just the opposite of what we're inclined to do. For men, it is easy for us to show other men respect. But it's difficult for us, oftentimes it's difficult to communicate to our wives in such a way that they feel loved. For women, it's easy to communicate that they love, but it's often difficult to communicate respect to their husbands. And our secular society teaches us to behave exactly in the way that is natural to us, but contradicts the way God asks us to do that. God wants everybody, husbands and wives, to love and respect each other, which is why Jesus enabled us to do that. But he doesn't want us to change our roles and how he designed us. Yet secular society is trying to do just that. Sorry, Scott. We see there's an increase in gay marriage. Janet Parshall from Moody Radio, and she's often a guest on Focus on the Family. She's an outspoken feminist speaker from a biblical perspective. And she discusses that the problem with our culture is that society says if two people are in love, what's wrong with them getting married? It doesn't matter what their sex is. And she relates that the point is there's absolute truth in situational ethics, and they're at war with each other. And situational ethics change as you go along. Absolute truth never changes. It stays the same. I could give you 4 examples in the New Testament where Paul 3 times and James 1 time actually quote the Talmud twice, and from 385 BC, and Plato and Socrates from 385 to 500 BC. So God's truth it transcends time. It never changes, and it never contradicts His word. So the main purpose of my speech is to talk about ministries that are fighting for Judeo-biblical standards in marriage and fighting for marriage in our country. So Dr. James Dobson from Focus on the Family talks that investing in family is probably the most important thing that you'll ever do. And it is. It is a lifelong commitment to your spouse, to your children-in-law, grandchildren, and so on. So, and they are fighting for marriage, but they can't do it without our support. Attorney Jay Sekulow, the American Center for Law and Justice, states that they're committed to ensuring ongoing freedom and liberty in the U.S. They don't charge for their services, but they can't perform those services without financial help. So the purpose of my statement is to point out that marriages are decreasing in our country. And the decrease in marriages is affecting our society as a whole. There's an archaeologist in Dr. Dobson's book, What Wives Wish Their Husbands Knew About Women, who has studied 18 major civilizations in the history of the world. And one thing they all have in common is they all got to a point of accepting open homosexuality. So I use Focus on the Family and American Center for Law and Justice and ask that you make a commitment to pray for these ministries on a regular basis, pray that they be strengthened, and to make a commitment to financially support them in any way possible. These 2 ministries are known in Washington, D.C. as being formidable opponents to the secular worldview and standing for a biblical worldview. So that's the point of my speech, is make a commitment, a small commitment. It doesn't have to be those. I just use those because they have the resources to fight for all of us. It'll help us, it'll help our marriages, it'll help our children, and pass a legacy on down throughout our generations. Thank you very much for your time.